Hello. Today we're going to be talking about Harold Harwell Lewis, also known as H. Lewis, often called the farmhand poet, incidentally, also the title of a 1981 movie about him, who is a communist American poet. You don't get too many of those these days, whose scope of work was during the Great Depression and in the modernist movement. Here is the bibliography of sources. I'd just like to point out quickly Douglas C. Wixon, the bottom source there, in his article In Search of the Low-Down Americano. A lot of this presentation is based off the work he did. He did a lot of great digging onto it. And that concept of the low-down Americano, of the voice of an American, will come up later in the presentation. William Carlos Williams described H. Lewis as a persistent dirt farmer and dairyman from Cape Girardeau, and I thought that was such a good and fitting description, and you'll see why as we talk more. H. Lewis was born in Cape Girardeau, Missouri in 1901 to a farming family, a family of sharecroppers, and he left at 19 because he hated it to travel around the country. And there in the pre-Depression America, he got a first-hand view of poverty across the nation. He took a lot of odd jobs like working in post's office or restaurant, busboying. He returned home to the family farm just at the end of the 20s where he starts his writing career. And then the Great Depression hits, and these left-leaning sentiments he's been developing from his travels across the country kind of get exacerbated by the economic climate. And during this period, he really starts kind of coming into his own as a writer for underrepresented, kind of disenfranchised communities, such as low-class workers, laborers, and the unemployed. And because of this kind of radical viewpoint in his writing, he has a really tough relationship with the establishment. He finds some success in like left-leaning magazines and journals, but even then he's still kind of it's tough going because of kind of gets caught up in faction wars and American foreign policy with the USSR. He dies in 1985, kind of out of the spotlight, but he's important to talk about because he was very interested in creating like a unique American voice, similar to William Carlos Williams, and he'll come up in the program. Now, during his life, H. Lewis published 4 books of poetry. They're very cheap to buy. Red Renaissance, Thinking of Russia, Salvation, and Road to Utterly. The last one, Road to Utterly, is kind of it's different than the rest because it talks about this kind of utopian society he calls Utterly, which is his kind of vision of an American utopia and how it has to be achieved through kind of like a democratic workmanship, this kind of sharing of labor. All these were published in Holt, Minnesota by B.C. Haglund, which I thought was a fun fact. But most of his work came through magazines. He was published in the American Mercury, the Anvil, the Masses, Poetry, 1938, and Rebel Poet, and he even had his own magazine for a short while called Outlander. He was particularly prolific in the Masses, and then his friend Jack Conroy, who'll come up later, put a lot of his stuff into the Anvil. I just want to talk quickly about his relationships with the establishment, because that came up a lot. H.L. Mencken, who is the editor of the American Mercury, kind of brings up this idea of the low-down Americano, which we talked about earlier, about finding a voice for the American laborer. And William Carlos Williams kind of identifies him as having a new sort of American literary history, kind of one that's been untold and is kind of developing in this time period. William Carlos Williams calling it something very important to look for. Even with this endorsement, though, he still had a lot of trouble with his views being accepted, like the Partisan Review, which was a left-leaning magazine at the time. He wrote one of the editors saying, "I have you in a well-bulwarked jam about this, and I know it hurts, comrade recent. You are hereby rendered into hamburger." That kind of vivid kind of writing style is kind of indicative of his poetry as well. But you can see here he had a lot of trouble getting along with people in the literary industry. The part of the reason he's not taught much is because he had such a hard time getting published. As we've kind of talked about, he's very influenced by the Russian Revolution and the advent of communism. A lot of his poetry focuses on workers, the poor, even race, like in the poem Show Enough, and also alienation. He uses a lot of vernacular language, and that can be traced back to his travel across the country, to Los Angeles, New Orleans, Toledo, particularly in the American Mercury essay Down the Skidway in 1933. There's a really great quote right at the end, which is, "From the poverty of America in this bottomless hell came these contorted and condemned souls." So you kind of get where he's coming from when he starts writing. We talk more about his influences here. Another great William Krause Williams quote about him I love is, "Again and again, Lewis comes back to it with that brain-bursting elevation which men believe in and believe that America represents, that is America to the whole world, that cry, Russia, 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 roaring with each for all. That's pure American revolutionary stuff." I love that. As such, his style, his friend Jack Conroy, who we mentioned earlier, says it has a crude vigor and it restores poetry to some of its ancient uses. For the wandering troubadour, saying not to literary critics, but to the unwashed and underfed, the common folk. He uses simple and blunt language in a mix of vernacular, dialect, and rhyme. That said, there's kind of a tension in a lot of his work between more formal qualities and more vernacular qualities. In the poem Tractors Eat Kerosene on the left here, you can see T-bones, T-bones, Lord, can't you hear me cry? Must weigh out my knee bones, a praying for T-bones. And in Shake Up at Senator Barbara, you get something which is a lot more formal in writing, which is, "How mighty is nature, how null the boast of man. Lecture it off, God's likeness, if you can." I know these are just two poems, but they do a really good job at showing this kind of contrast in his stuff. I'd like to go to three different poems now. In Farmhands Are Fain, which is probably his most famous poem, it starts with, "You repocrat squires in the farm bureau, you demi-rep lairds in the grange, your bigness content with the status quo and alarmed at the rumblings of change." That kind of progresses to something a bit less formal in like lest sympathy function. "In enviable kitchens with everything so handy and white and clean, they turn a knob, the motor hums, and down goes an all-inclusiveness that won't clog the pipes." And finally, in the brilliant poem Oink, you get this really lax kind of style. Razorbacks impromptu under the Circean wand of reaction in the marble sty of Little Rock. Arkansas legislatures have already squealed with the porcine preference, which is just beautiful. Just to close out from Williams, I think there's a really good line here. In the top right, you can see, "He speaks in no uncertain terms." And I think that's really crucial to understand H.H. Lewis, is that a lot of his work is very focused, it's very direct, it's vernacular, but it also has this tension in it with more formal qualities. It gives this kind of alienation between form and substance often, and it makes for really interesting poetry. Anyway, thank you for listening.